Okay, good morning and welcome everyone. So pleased to have you all here in Hudson River Park. It's such a beautiful venue, and I am so thrilled we're able to gather today. I appreciate everyone taking the time out of their busy schedule to join us. We have here partners across diverse disciplines who all understand the critical role that our parks play in the lives of New Yorkers and in the viability and, importantly, in the resiliency of our city. I also want to thank our partners at Google and at the Hudson River Park Trust for making this beautiful space available to us this morning. Such a great place to gather. Today is an important one for the Parks Department. We are launching our Vital Parks for All, investing in New York City's living infrastructure, which is our vision to equitably strengthen the health, environment, and the communities all across New York City through our park system. A vital park system, we know, is about more than public open space. A park system is vital when New Yorkers have access within their own communities to green spaces that are clean and safe to use, that are alive with nature and people and programs, and importantly, are resilient to a changing climate. And we know more than ever, we all need vital parks. More people are using our parks since COVID. People are more lonely, anxious, in need of social connection. And this has led to greater mental and physical health challenges. But our parks connect people to one another, to nature and programming that improve their well-being. The effects of climate change we know are intensifying with extreme heat. We are certainly feeling it this week. Worsening air pollution and more severe and sudden storms with punishing rains and rising seas, making our green spaces and nature critical to safeguarding our city. Our parks infrastructure is aging, with much of our system constructed during the building boom of the 1950s, or in many cases even earlier. Vital Parks for All, investing in New York City's living infrastructure, is our plan to restore aging park facilities, deliver new park resources where they are needed most, and importantly, empower New Yorkers with the data they need to both celebrate and support their parks. Vital Parks for All is a $3.2 billion initial investment in our city's living infrastructure. We're so pleased to have you here today to talk about this new initiative. And it's also my pleasure to introduce our Deputy Mayor, Mira Zoshi, who is helping ensure we deliver on Vital Parks for all New Yorkers. Welcome, Deputy Mayor.
Thank you very much, everyone. And I'm Mira Zoshi, Deputy Mayor for Operations. So my portfolio covers the city's infrastructure. And under the Adams administration, the Parks Department is considered part of the city's infrastructure and was shifted to the operations portfolio. And I think today's report really demonstrates all the reasons why that's critically true. It is just important that we have healthy, vital parks to New York's survival, as it is that our water system works, that our trash is picked up, that our buildings stay standing. And as the commissioner noted, since COVID, that has become first and forefront in so many of our tireless advocates' minds, because COVID really brought out the necessity of our green space. So I really want to just take a moment to thank everybody who's worked on this report. And especially I want to take a moment to thank our commissioner who's led in difficult times a sprawling empire of 30,000 acres of green space. And the men and women, the parkies that are every day, whether it is cold, whether it is hot, whether it is raining, or whether it is not, out in our parks, making them beautiful for the entire city and all of our visitors every single moment of every day. But I think this week is a real reminder of the vital nature of our parks. Under our unrelenting sun that we have this week, our parks are our air conditioning. They're our oasis. They're our source of joy, hope, family, and motivation. And they're as fundamental to us as water, food, or shelter. It's this living infrastructure that turns down the thermostat, filters our air, and absorbs water through torrential storms. And it's thanks to the hard work of the parkies that make it alive and also make it full of amenities. Because it's the thousands of facilities in our city parks, our rec centers, our playgrounds, our soccer fields. My son will kill me, but I'm going to say this: pickleball courts. I'm going to throw in one for him: handball courts. Pools, beaches, running tracks, trails, dog runs, nature centers, goats sometimes, home away from home, helping people swim, play, gain skills, get fit, and find happiness. Sometimes find love too. So today we've gathered here an expert field of people who know intimately the benefits that parks bring for public health, economy, art, environmental stewardship, advocacy, resiliency, and what they really do to improve the overall nature of our city. So we're extremely excited to launch Vital Parks for All and the significant investment that the city is making in our living infrastructure. I want to do a quick poll though. How many people have been in a park in the last 24 hours? In the last 12 hours? In the last 6 hours? And I say that because we've heard a lot of talk about 1% for parks, which is absolutely, a goal that we all believe in. But I also have another goal: 100% of people in parks. And that means 100% of New Yorkers get to experience our parks because they are close, they are within walking distance, and they have the amenities that they need, and that they're well maintained. So they're inviting and they're enjoyable, and they create such a memory that you can't wait to get back. And we have so much potential. If you look, anybody that was out yesterday, I know Katie and Honan and I were having a small ladies' room conversation about, I had the fortune of being at Brighton Beach yesterday, packed. Everywhere you went, our parks and our beaches and our public space was packed. The moment that New Yorkers have time off, that's where they go. And it's our job to make sure that the future generations not only have this opportunity, but have an even better one. That's our gift to New York City. That's our gift to our kids and our grandkids and our future. So I want to turn it back over to Commissioner Donoghue, and really my heartfelt, deep, deep, deep gratitude for the tireless work that everybody does at every end of the spectrum to keep our green infrastructure alive and welcoming. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Joshi. We're extremely grateful for your commitment to our parks and communities across the 5 boroughs. When the deputy mayor was talking about being out in parks, in the last 6 hours, I'm sure because she was running in them as she does. We cross paths quite often in Brooklyn, but thank you for all your support. We so appreciate it. It is now my pleasure to join with Dr. Lourdes Rodriguez, CEO of the David Rockefeller Fund, for a conversation on the power of parks for community health and well-being. Welcome, Lourdes.
What a great morning.
Great morning. Thank you for being here.
Absolutely. I think our work got a lot easier because we can just say what Sochil said.
So we can just say what?
We can just say what Sochil said. Like and like she set the stage beautifully for the conversation.
Exactly, exactly. Thank you so much, Dr. Rodriguez, for being here. When we were thinking about this forum this morning, we talked about a fireside chat, and I said, no, we can't do a fireside chat. It's the summer, and we're parkies. We need to do a park bench chat. So that is why, through magic of our parkies, we have this wonderful setup. So thank you. I'm thrilled to have this conversation with you this morning. We know, all of us in this room, and as the deputy mayor said, our parks heal and they strengthen New Yorkers. They offer a place for play, stress release, physical activity. We know that they provide mental health benefits. They reduce stress, help to lower blood pressure, and they allow New Yorkers to connect with others, providing social connection to mitigate the loneliness crisis that's been so much in the news. As a part-time New Yorker and a public health expert, can you talk about your experience with how parks can improve individual health and are an essential part of the public health system?
Absolutely. And I did ask so to call me part-time New Yorker because I am not a former New Yorker. I am a, New Yorker at heart. My heart is in Washington Heights and Inwood. So thank you so much for calling me a part-time New Yorker. So one of the things that we think about when we think about population health is the collective accrual of individual, health, markers. And parks help with the individual health markers, right? They're the great places to be physically active, and that's an easy connection to make. They're a great place for our mental health because we are connected with nature. But the parts about health that I find even more valuable than the physical and mental health is the social connection that we can make with others. Because we are social animals, right? We are connected and in ways that are really difficult to measure to each other. And parks are the places where we can connect across ways of life, across differences. Parks create spaces where you can meet the other, right? Like we naturally tend to congregate in institutions, organizations with people who have a lot of our own beliefs and values. But when you go to the park, you can connect across those differences. So for me, the value at the population health level of parks is that they are great equalizers. So in the parks, it's Lourdes and Sue, not commissioner and doctor, right?
Absolutely.
Like we come together in that way. And then the other piece about the importance of parks as places for health and for that social cohesion is that those are the places where we make memories. Those are the places where the history of neighborhoods is written. And when we lack those public spaces, we lack that shared memory that allows us to remember the things in the past that we should fix and envision a new future that is better for everybody. So that's how I see the connection.
Absolutely. Thank you. So well said. For us in the Parks Department, we think a lot about well-maintained, well-programmed parks and the impact that has on community well-being and building that social cohesion that you just referenced, Dr. Rodriguez. We know that parks do serve as safe havens for protests, for vigils, civic ceremonies. You referenced they're common ground for people, bringing people from all walks of life together, whether that be at the basketball court, at our pools, playgrounds, our movie nights, community festivals. They build community and belonging through human connection and care. And as a result, also help to enhance safety. Just last month, the Trust for Public Land, I know Tamara's here, shout out to Trust for Public Land, released a study that shows well-maintained parks encourage social connections across income disparities, which we know is so important. Are there, Dr. Rodriguez, are there specific examples you can point to of how parks have helped foster community, build across differences and maybe even heal fractures in neighborhoods. And, why is a strong social fabric so critical to community well-being?
So I'm gonna have to ask you to call me Lourdes because
I know it's too much, Dr.
it's too
Wright.
much. We're in
It's
the
Lourdes and
bench.
Sue. We're on a
We're
park
in the
bench.
park.
Exactly.
Lourdes.
I'm with that.
So I want to take you back to the early 90s and early 2000s to Washington Heights, a place that I love dearly. During the time of the height of the violence and crack epidemic in that neighborhood, people retrieved into their homes because that was how you kept safe.
Mhm.
And as a result of that, a lot of our parks became underutilized or they became ghost towns.
Mhm.
On the park side, when we were trying to protect park spaces, sometimes it seemed like the easiest thing to do was to border up entrances, to cover stairs with dirt and like keep people from going into the park and crossing from one part of the neighborhood to another. We crossed the High Bridge. On the parallel fracture that was happening in the neighborhood was happening inside the parks.
Mhm.
And that just exacerbated the disconnection, the distrust. So I used to work at a little school up north called Columbia University at the School of Public Health. And as part of the work there, we had a Center for Youth Violence Prevention. And we thought about youth violence, not only as why can't you be more like your brother or why can't you behave, but also like what are the stages, what are the places where youth violence happens. And we thought if we're going to bring back our neighborhood, we need to think about the built environment component of our interventions. It can't just be like individual level behavioral change for like well-behaved kids. We need to think about the spaces, the public spaces where they move. And by virtue of their connection to their families and everybody else, the networks where everybody moves. So I'm going somewhere with this, I promise you. So then we thought, how do you activate a public space that has been forgotten, that people have all of these ideas of what happens there. So we started our project by taking walks with neighbors, with leaders from nonprofit organizations. And the invitation was for them to think about their memory of that place and their actual experience of the place. You know why? Because there had already been work to steward the parks. There had already been like work to fix the trails. There had already been done to work to bring those places back to be usable. But people's perceptions of the parks as being dangerous were keeping them from enjoying those amenities.
Mhm. Mhm.
So in that activation of neighborhood leaders, of neighbors, we started to bring people back and inviting them to think about how they could bring their programming out of doors and into the parks. Because by bringing their programming out of doors and into the parks, they would activate those spaces, but they would activate those spaces with different kinds of people. So the Art for Washington Senior Center could bring their seniors to walk, and they would walk at a certain time of the day. And the high school at the top of the hill could bring their kids that were doing a alternative physical education program into the park to practice for their 100-mile race that they did every year. And before that, they were bordering the park because they didn't know that they could go through the park.
Mhm.
And and we figured, okay, so this is kind of working.
Mhm.
And we added a component of having an annual celebration where people could walk together. Because if you walk together with others, you start to demystify. We call that exercising through exercising. And but there were so many other benefits to that intervention. Over the 20 years that Hike the Heights, which is the flagship event that we developed over the project, over the past 20 years, people from on top of the hill of, Fort Tryon Park have been meeting with people from the bottom of the hill by Edgecombe and Highbridge Park. And there's something that happens when you get to know your neighbors in that way, when you do the planning for the event. That civic muscle that you use for coming together, you then use that civic muscle in other ways. You get activated for stewardship, not for ownership, because ownership, there's something about, well, I can do whatever I want because this is mine. But stewardship is love in action. I don't know, did I answer your question?
I think so.
Okay.
I think so, Lourdes. And you provided a really good lead in to the next topic that I wanted to address. You referenced it with the High Bridge being closed and the message, the signal that sent, and cutting off communities. At the Parks Department, obviously, we think a lot about capital investment. We have men from our capital team here who do such amazing work to enliven our communities and our parks, to raise Braddock. We know that it makes a huge difference. And we actually have a recent study, the Physical Activity and Redesigned Community Spaces. It's called the Park Study. It's a 6-year collaboration we did between New York City Parks and CUNY Graduate School of Public Health, that it was exploring exactly this relationship between a neighbor's built environment and the health of the community. And it assessed community health, where we made significant capital upgrades to neighborhood parks in areas of historic disinvestment. That's through our CPI sites. And we redesigned the parks in collaboration with the community, which we always look to do, rebuilding sites to meet really their priorities. And not surprisingly, the park study revealed increased park use and therefore improved health following renovations. We know that it's about the investment. And that's why with this Vital Parks initiative that we're launching today, it's focused on that incredible investment, $3.2 billion in our park system, because we know that that needs to happen. It's about aging infrastructure. The study also showed how the health and well-being of the larger community improved well beyond the park's boundaries. So it's all things we know, but great to have a study that actually helps to show that. And so I'm curious, based on your work in communities, both in New York City and in Austin, can you speak a little bit to how targeted investment in community parks results in improved health outcomes, especially in historically underserved areas?
So I would be remiss if I didn't say that investment begets investment.
Yeah,
Right?
absolutely.
So that
Yeah.
when you fix a place, other investment follows. And I would also be remiss if I didn't say that oftentimes the contested part of investments is investments for whom.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So a key component of ensuring that you have healthy, thriving parks is that your investments are going to be benefiting and going to be enjoyed by as many different kinds of people as possible. And investments in infrastructure help with things like connectivity. Right? So I'm thinking about the giant steps that connect the bottom of Highbridge Park by 160th Street, where the cab drivers come together to have coffee and wait, take a little break, with the top of the hill. I'm thinking about, I have so many Highbridge examples, but I will think about other ones. I'm thinking about the bathroom at Edgecombe and in 163rd Street, that because there is that infrastructure, people linger, right? Like, I can be longer with my kids in the park. A senior can come in without having to stop by at the Dunkin' Donuts first before coming to the park. There is something about the infrastructure that signals that you are valued, that signals that this is a safe place to come, but also that signals you are invited here. And we also invite you to become a steward of this place.
Yeah.
Because if the Parks Department is investing, then I want to be a contributor to that, to the maintenance of that place. There is such an important connection between coming together in public spaces and democracy. Because when you understand how decisions about resources are made in the city, you can start like in Spanish we say los pininos, like your early days, your early steps in like community organizing is demanding and ensuring that the infrastructure meets your needs. And then you can take that to advocate for housing rights. And then you can take that to advocate um, for no more development of fossil fuel infrastructure. And then you can take that to other places. That civic muscle it's easier to flex it uh, when you are working to ensure that investments in parks are meeting your needs.
Absolutely. And such a good lead into our, with the Vital Parks Initiative, a big part of it is just creating tools for New Yorkers to use to empower New Yorkers with more information about what exists in their parks today, to celebrate what is an incredible park system, but also where it's lacking, and to give New Yorkers the ability to compare across communities and to then be able to advocate. We know, so you said, knowledge is power.
Yes.
And we want people to both know what they have in their communities, celebrate what they have, but also be able to say, I want this, I want that within a 10-minute walk. So the tools that are part of Vital Parks are really important as well. And people can take a test drive. We have them available at terminals out in the meeting area.
Can I trouble you to add a finer point to this
Yes.
part?
Yeah.
One of so the parks is making investments, and the way that the rest of us make investments in parks is mainly through our time, right?
Yeah.
So another important part to facilitate citizen investment in parks is making it easier for us to use the parks
Absolutely.
and contribute to the activation of those spaces by bringing our activities, our celebrations, both formal and informal, the basketball and baseball teams utilizing the facilities. So facilitating the processes that allow everyone to come into the parks
interact
and use them
Yeah.
is also as important as the cash that you put in.
Exactly. Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And this is, we talked a lot about it's a significant investment, but it is also about providing that level of information and the ability to really engage in so many different ways. The other thing that's really important about Vital Parks and about what we do as an agency, one of what we call our value pillars is about being green and resilient. So a big part of what we do is maintain over 5 million trees across the city. We take that responsibility very seriously because we know that it is living infrastructure. That's what we want to communicate. And all communities need to have parks that are full of nature, that are alive, not only for the mental and physical benefits that we've talked about, but also to combat the extreme heat that we're seeing, capture carbon, filter stormwater, grow resilience. We know that all helps enhance communities. And so that's why, as part of this investment, we talked yesterday, we launched Let's Swim NYC, that really focuses on pool infrastructure, because we know the challenges we have to address in terms of kids being able to swim, adults being able to swim, but also it's an incredible investment in our trees and in our wetlands and in our restoration work. We are fortunate to have, through this administration, $150 million going into tree planting and a record number of trees, 18,000 trees being planted this year, the most in 6 years. All of those aspects are what contribute, we know, to a vital park system. And we're prioritizing, as we talked about, and as you so appropriately pointed out, Lourdes, the importance of prioritizing that investment in communities of greatest need. So with our tree planting, really targeting that to heat vulnerable neighborhoods and making sure that's where we're going first and stocking trees in those neighborhoods. And I know that similarly, the David Rockefeller Fund's climate program aims to support and sustain bold, science-based leadership on equitable climate solutions. So can you talk to us a little bit, why does the fund support organizations serving underfunded constituencies and geographic areas that have been most disproportionately affected by the climate crisis?
Absolutely. And it's awesome that you're quoting me my website, because that means like it works. We did our homework. We did our homework. So I will say that the not addressing the climate crisis in this moment is going to be more expensive if we wait and we wait until things get worse. So let's just call a spade, right? And so at DRF, one of the things that we are very aware about is that in communities that have been left behind, there is an overlap of crises, right? Like it's not just that they are less likely to be resilient. They are more likely to be, and you can insert here any social health marker or marker related to finances or education, and they tend to overlap in the same communities. So when you make investments, you get more bang for your buck, so to speak, when you go to communities that have been underserved for decades. You are also starting to change the design of things, right? So when the overlap of crises in underserved communities it doesn't happen randomly, it's by design. So when you start sending investment, you are changing the design of things. You're changing the way that systems operate because you're prioritizing in communities that have fallen out of that prioritization before. And I would add that in the way that we think about our work related to climate at DRF, we think about the work as needing multiple systems involved and for that work to be operating at multiple levels. And when you think about parks and you think about the relationship of citizens to parks, when you think about the relationship of people to parks, let me not use the word citizens. When you think about the relationship of people to parks, period, people, that is like, you can like the evidence of what's going on with our climate crisis is in front of you. You cannot escape it. But it's also an easy entry point for action, right? Like we need to mobilize at multiple levels. We need the industry to start like taking responsibility for the mess that we have, made in our planet. You need governments to allocate resources, but you also need engaged citizens in doing our part to, creating a more resilient world. So the way that we think about it at DRF is that we look to invest in communities that have been underserved because we are creating an entry point for them to be active, and we're also facilitating, civic engagement when for a lot of folks, civic engagement is an add-on to everything else that they're working on, to managing their families, to ensuring that they have all of the things that they need to make the rent, right? When we support nonprofit organizations that are doing that work to mobilize communities, we are adding an extra seat at the table and not a folding chair, like an actual comfy seat at the table for action.
Absolutely. Well said. And it's a perfect lead in to talk about community engagement, because for us, when we talk about our Vital Parks initiative, it's about vital parks are clean and safe, they're green and resilient, but they're also made up of engaged and empowered New Yorkers. That is such an important element for us, that community engagement, that aspect of getting out and being involved in your park. It's one of our top priorities in Vital Parks for All. And we have worked for many years to empower our park partners. We're fortunate we have over 1,000 partners, many of whom are in this room and have done such great work over so many years. And we know this stakeholder collaboration is essential in improving our parks, improving the environment. Our community partners provide great programs. They monitor conditions. They keep us on our toes. They advocate for resources, and they expand our reach. They're what allows us to do so much more than we'd be able to otherwise. We're so thankful for it. And that's why with this initiative, we really wanted to highlight that. Like, that is necessary. We know that we've benefited absolutely purposely from that engagement of New Yorkers, but we also really believe that that benefit goes both ways. Then engaging in your parks, engaging your community helps people feel good. I can make an impact. I can address the issues of climate change. I can plant a tree. And we know that that's beneficial both ways. That's why it's so important for us in this initiative to highlight that element too as critical, that engagement, empowering New Yorkers with tools, with information, tools both digitally and physically, gloves and shovels and all the things that we provide, and information, importantly. And I know you referenced this, Lourdes, but while you were at the Kimmelman School of Public Health, you catalyzed Hike the Heights, which brought individuals and groups from Harlem, Washington Heights, and Inwood to lead hikes through their neighborhoods to Highbridge Park. And it is in no small measure of outcome of that there are funds that were allocated to renovate the High Bridge, that community engagement, that focus on that park and the needs of that park. 20 years later, I know just celebrated the 20-year anniversary of Hike the Heights, which is amazing. The movement continues and engages people with their parks, strengthening both individual and community health. I want to ask, how is community engagement, empowerment key to strengthening communities, and why is this so relevant in addressing the current climate crisis?
Yeah. So the funny thing about the longevity of Hike the Heights is that for the first 7 years of that project, that was supported by the Centers for Disease Control through a grant to the Kimmelman School of Public Health, to the Center for Youth Violence Prevention. 7 years. And we just celebrated our 20th anniversary. Why? Because the engaged organizations that were, and leaders that were at the table when we started Hike the Heights, they became the stewards and the keepers of the legacy and the work. And then when you think about the relationships that are built when you are coming together to work in parks,
side by side,
regardless of whether you stay at the same organization that you were before, if you have those relationships, you take those with you to the next job and the next gig. And you continue the tradition, because the benefits that you get are far greater than all the schlepping that happens, or the planning, the planning meetings that happen in preparation to the event, right? Like, the benefit is so huge. People recognize it, that, this last iteration of Hike the Heights, we still had our community organizations that were partnering, but the bulk of the work was done by our beautiful stewards that are over there in the back row. And I want to give them a big shout out. That regardless of whether they are affiliated with an organization or not, this is part of, it has become part of family tradition for them, right? Family, the extended family that we all make in our neighborhoods. But the other reason why engagement is important is that we only see the world through our personal experience. And we lack eyes in the back of our head. And when we engage multiple constituencies, multiple kinds of people, it's like having eyes in the back of your head. You get a different perspective. You see the world in a different way. And engagement allows for that to happen, because it shatters this notion of the Lone Ranger that like carries the brunt of the work. Engagement brings people in relationship to each other, and that adds perspective. So when I think about the climate crisis and the work that we support at the David Rockefeller Fund, some of that work is about building community power through supporting organizing. And that only happens if people feel committed and engaged and in relationship to their neighbors and their communities.
Mhm. And Hike the Heights is such an important example of the power of community coming together and what can evolve and how it can take on a life of its own
I
almost,
know,
right?
we have a bathroom now. Like, guys, you have no idea how hard it is to get a funder to pay for a porta potty because it's not sexy. I'm like, you want our money to do what? And like, if we were expecting people, because some people come from as far south as 110th Street and Central Park West, and some people come from as far north as Inwood Hill Park by the flag post. Um, and like, you expect them to come and then not provide them a place to like take care of their needs. That's hard. And so when we started Hike the Heights, we had to like beg, borrow, and steal. Not steal. We never steal. To be able to pay for porta potties. And I have never taken a selfie in front of a bathroom until, June 1st, 2024, when we saw the beautiful bathrooms that like are there not only for the one day a year, but like permanently. So, yes.
Many in this room can relate to the importance of public restrooms, porta potties, getting funding for porta potties. It is critical to so much of what we do and people's enjoyment of park.
Yes,
It's so important. That's why we've done a whole lot of work focus on public restrooms. And again, hats off to the Capitol team and Therese, really looking at all kinds of innovative approaches to creating new bathrooms, doing it more cheaply, more efficiently, because it's pretty much the number one ask that we have. I want to also just cover a really important topic, which is equity. We talked about that somewhat. At the Parks Department, we have a long-standing commitment to expanding equity, from initiatives like the Community Parks Initiative to maximizing the number of MWBE contracts we award. And through Vital Parks, investing in New York City's living infrastructure, we are prioritizing resources in communities that have faced environmental injustice, historic disinvestment. And that's such an important aspect of what we've done through this initiative, is mapping all of our assets, seeing where they are and seeing where they're not. And it will help us to guide our future investment, but it will also help communities to say, hey, I want this. Really, really important aspect of what we do is really looking at equity across the system, not just in physical space, but in where we plant trees and everything that we do, thinking about it through the lens of equity. And I know that similarly at your fund, the program areas of justice, climate, and arts for social impact center on those people most disproportionately impacted by mass incarceration, the climate crisis. It activates artists in service of action. I know you also focus on organizations working in underfunded constituencies and geographic areas. Can you talk a little bit about the progress towards equity that you see in the communities where your foundation makes grants?
So to understand the importance of engaging people who have been directly impacted, you need to think about what it takes to show up to places where decisions are being made. In my personal life, I love coming together with my neighbors. The only times that I've had to like knock on my neighbors' doors is when we're planning a block party. In communities that are disinvested, you need to organize and mobilize people for things that are a lot more important than a block party, like ensuring that that there is drainage infrastructure so your neighborhood doesn't flood during rains, to ensure that you come together to stop an additional infrastructure that is going to bring liquefied natural gas through your community. Like, the organizing that needs to happen in those communities, it's 100 times more difficult than knocking on the door and saying, please sign here so we can close the street and have a party, right? That takes time. Showing up to meetings takes time. Showing up to advocate, share the data, right? This is not just in your head. Like, there are health implications to all of the unequal conditions that communities face. And so in my role at an philanthropic organization, funding that work helps create equity because it allows people to have the time to show up.
Absolutely.
And in the context of parks work, it's a lot easier. Like the barrier to showing up, it's a lot lower. But being able to understand that for a family where the head of household may have 2 jobs or may have to work in odd hours to make ends meet, being able to have access to parks programming at the times that are convenient for them, for the children or for the elderly, that is really important. You are creating equity when you're lowering the barrier to accessing those spaces. So for us, it's about ensuring the voices of people who have been receiving the hardest impact, for them to be able to show at the table. The way that I see that showing up in parks is that you are creating an easier way to connect to the parks, for people who have experienced time famine because they have so many other things going on in their life.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It is, we want people to engage, but we know how difficult it is. Like we said, people working 2 jobs, managing family. And so that's why the focus on, I know that your funding is so important. The focus from foundations on supporting this grassroots level work is critical to getting people out, to getting people to be able to engage. So thank you. I think we have time for a few questions from the audience. I think we passed out some cards. If there's some things people want to ask myself or Lourdes.
Pass the cards forward.
Do people have questions? Yeah, we can hand you
Oh,
the
we can do the
mics.
mic thing.
You had a question?
Thanks both for this thrilling discussion. And as somebody who has previously attempted to fundraise for bathrooms, I understand that it is the vital, unsexy work of being a park steward. And Dr. Rodriguez, I would be curious to know, in light of the understanding that this $3 billion that the city is investing in parks is almost certainly going to deliver benefits that are many multiples of that over. And we've seen time and time again that parks continually subsidize economic development, resilience, as we're seeing social equity and civic engagement. What arguments, tools, or methodologies can you point to that would ensure that some of those benefits come back to parks and stay within the agency, or are better recognized by the city and various stakeholders who benefit from those? Thank you.
Oh my gosh, get out of my head, man. So I said earlier that investment begets investments, right? The support that the Parks Department puts into ensuring that we have the right infrastructure and the right programming, it already sets up the stage for economic benefits for the surrounding communities, for the people that use it. And it honestly, it creates a great, exciting environment for companies who want to recruit talent, right? So one way to show the love and appreciation for the impact that great public spaces have for economy is to enter into the kind of partnership where those companies that are benefiting from that enhanced, exciting place where you're inviting your clients and you're inviting your workforce and you're inviting people to come and join you in your mission. I think that is an important place to ask for some of that love back, all of the benefits that they're receiving, and the mechanisms like the City Parks Foundation and Partnerships for Parks are a great mechanism, a great way to ensure that the folks that have the access to the resources, the financial resources, whether it be a private company or whether it be an institution, those are great mechanisms for ensuring that some of those resources come back to the parks. Um, I know that there are some companies that do things like, stewardship days, and they like come together and volunteer. And that, absent a connection to the people in the neighborhood, it really doesn't do much, but it does a little bit. So mobilizing the folks that are benefiting through partnerships with, some of those vehicles, Partnership for Parks or City Parks Foundation, to me is one way to I'm going to say cash in some of the benefits that people are accruing on their end. I hope that answers your question.
And I would, Lourdes, just add to that too. It's not coincidence that we term this vital parks and living infrastructure, because we need New Yorkers, we need funders, we need administration, we need everyone to be thinking about parks as vital and that they're living and need to be maintained. We talk about the importance of infrastructure in the city. The defining factor of parks is that it's living and it's evolving, and therefore it needs to be maintained. So in terms of thinking about how do we ensure that the resources come back to parks, it is about galvanizing that support through how we describe the importance of parks, how we describe the importance of this specific infrastructure that everyone in this room cares about. We need, it's interesting to hear the deputy mayor say she wants everyone in parks. We want everyone to not only be in parks, we want them to be cheerleading, advocating, recognizing the myriad benefits. And that's why with this initiative, we're terming it as vital, we're talking about it as living, and we're providing tools to really fully engage all different diverse aspects of decision makers, stakeholders, community people, to really help in that rallying cry about how important our parks are.
Hi, thank you. My name is Rosa Chang, and I'm from Gotham Park, which is a new park. We're only 1 year old, but we are growing. And so number one, you're literally saying everything that my heart believes. So thank you for all of that. Number two, the city, I'm also a member of a community board here, and the city is taking around the city of yes. And that relates to the housing infrastructure that we are, and especially the affordable housing infrastructure that we are looking to put in the city. As I think we all in this room agree, parks and public space are deeply necessary civic infrastructure, because New York is nothing without New Yorkers, right? So can we build city of yes to mandate that for every investment and benefit given by increased zoning, increased floor area ratio, that we also mandate that some of that money go towards funding the public infrastructure of our parks in each neighborhood where that is utilized, so that it is spread across the entire city and that it stays in the neighborhood where people are being added, so that they are able to also benefit from the public spaces that are in these communities, and that they can be part of actually building the public spaces that benefit their community, our communities. And then the last one is, can I talk to you later?
Yes, and if I happen to run out of the room before we connect, Jen hope I can keep in mind. So the answer is yes. I would say that oftentimes we use a mechanism of expecting developers to create public spaces that are accessible, but if you do an inventory of those spaces around the city, they are more commercial and hard to find, so they look like private spaces than they are public benefit spaces. So the demand needs to be there, but without a clear set of guidelines about what we expect for those spaces to be accessible to everybody, we're going to end up with a lot of cop-out, for lack of a better word. But thank you for your comments.
Oh, no, I mean a fun, developers need to put.
Right, instead of like adding a plaza, like put the money there.
Yeah,
Yes.
It only funds our parks, our existing
Yes.
parks, our new parks, our public spaces, and no other part of the city can touch that money. Like,
Yes,
that's
that
really-
translates into don't make it yourself, give us the money and like we'll work on it.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I see another, there you go, you have applause on the other side.
Yes. I'm afraid that we do have to end. Do you want to just take
One last
one
question.
last question?
Hi, Newport Chartery, CEO of IOB, and I'll say that I have been a student of Lourdes's when she was teaching at that tiny school
no.
up in northern Manhattan, and I've forever been a student. So if you can become a student of Lourdes's, I think we all are now. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
You know, the question that I have is so much of what I've seen over the knowing you for the last 15 years about, and you've shared the story of Hike the Heights, right? The case making for what we are now celebrating, right? This larger investment, this real deep understanding of the connection between health, space, place, and people. But there is no rest for the weary. And so my question is for both of you, because IOB does so much with people and citizens and folks across the country around case making, what is the next thing that we need to be making the case for? And I'm curious about, for both of you, what are the top two things that you would say that, like, now that we've gotten this, now that we're still building that, what are the other two things that you're like thinking about that we can mobilize folks around?
That's a great wrap-up question.
Yes, it sure is. Do you want to go first or should I?
What I would say is that in a moment where fracture has become evident, like fracture because we're polarized politically, fracture because we may not call it segregation, but we have cities that are highly segregated. In those moments, maintaining and stewarding parks becomes critical to restoring connection and repairing fracture.
Thank you. And a great question. I'm thinking about two things. One, that people will utilize this tool, understand what we're trying to provide, and get involved in their parks, get further involved for all the reasons Lourdes talked about this morning that we discussed this morning. I'm thinking very much about how can we grow the pool of stakeholders, investors, funders, resources to continue to support these 30,000 acres. It's a huge, huge responsibility. We've got an incredible team, but we need to continue to build on the resources to support it. Okay. Thank you, Lourdes. This has been you are such an inspiring individual. The work you've done to empower communities is so incredibly inspiring, important, vital. Thank you for joining us this morning. So appreciate your time. Safe travels back to Austin. We loved having you. Thank you. We're going to work a little magic. We're just going to do a little scene change here to get set up for our next panel. So just bear with us 2 minutes. We're just going to move some things around. Okay, everyone, I think that we're going to get back to it. We got a little bit of break and definitely want to thank Dr. Lourdes Rodriguez, just such an inspiring park bench chat. She was wonderful. But it is now my great pleasure to bring up this next panel of esteemed colleagues and collaborators with New York City Parks for a panel discussion entitled Parks for Community and Environmental Resiliency. So really continuing the theme from this morning. The panel will be moderated by Michael Kimmelman, architecture critic for the New York Times, and the author most recently of The Intimate City. He is founder and editor-at-large of Headway, a new philanthropically supported initiative at the Times addressing global challenges and paths toward progress. I'm also delighted to introduce Gregg Bishop, the executive director of the Joe and Clara Tsai Foundation Social Justice Fund, a key partner of ours at New York City Parks in improving Brooklyn parks in particular. Next to Gregg, we have Eric Sanderson, Ph.D., Vice President of Urban Conservation Strategy at NYBG, and author of Mannahatta. Welcome, Eric. Next to Eric, we have Thelma Golden, Director and Chief Curator, the Studio Museum in Harlem. Yay, Thelma. Who we are so thankful collaborated with New York City Parks to bring dynamic public art into our historic Harlem parks. And then also Erica Svensson, Ph.D., research social scientist with the USDA Forest Service and a longtime partner of the New York City Parks Department. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to hand it over to Michael.
Thank you, Sue, and hi, everybody. We're just going to have a fairly free conversation. I'm hoping we can leave some time at the end for questions. So if you have them as we're going along, jot them down and hand them in. I was listening earlier to something that Dr. Rodriguez said, which was, describing parks as places, of course, where you meet people who you wouldn't ordinarily come across. It's such an obvious thing. It's what we do in subways. It's what we do on the sidewalk. It's it's the very essence of an urban condition. And it is so fundamental to our idea of a functioning democracy and a civil society. And, I'm writing about water at the moment in California, in LA. Is anybody out here from there? There you go. Like a smattering of applause. Hello. Yeah. So I won't monopolize this whole conversation, I promise. But it turns out LA's kind of got its act together, sort of, around water in LA, which struck me as surprising. But in talking to people about water, I'm often struck, and this concerns even editors of mine and others, like, well, water, why does water? Like, that's not a subject. It's like air. It's just something you take for granted. Like, I don't know what you're talking about. And I sometimes think parks are a similar sort of thing, they're so fundamental, like sidewalks and housing and everything else. But we have a way of not just taking them for granted, but somehow not thinking of them as fundamental to our well-being. And obviously, we've talked a lot about different ways that they are. And really what we're talking about here, I think, is how to change that conversation, that understanding. And that it's true of libraries too. I write a lot about libraries, and I think it's something else. You see it in funding streams, of course, and I think even in philanthropic communities where it's not always clear why this is an urgent issue. So I'm glad we're going to look forward to talking to Gregg especially about issues around gun violence and some things that we don't necessarily know well. One little note about that before we turn to that, I'll just say I was also looking at a study related to Headway, this project that I am involved with, around gun violence. And there's a study, it's been going on for at least 20 or more, almost 30 years, at the University of Pennsylvania, now at Columbia. And it looks at areas of high gun violence, urban areas of high gun violence, in which you have empty lots and a lot of abandoned, you probably know about this, Gregg, and other sort of abandoned sites. And the study has shown that the experiment was basically greening some of these lots, just essentially creating a sense that these places are not abandoned lots, but are cared for and that they're green. And two things came out of this, which I think speaks to why we're here. One is that incidents of violence proximate to those areas decline. They don't decline a spectacular amount, but they decline a significant amount, enough to be meaningful. But the other thing is that actually, then these are often areas where you have serious health problems for lots of reasons, and a lot of stress. Heart rates actually decline. They have a specific documented impact on health. And I think, you know, when we're gathered here, and I'm hoping this conversation will also turn to this too, we all agree, right? Like parks are great and we go to parks and we grew up going to parks if we came and lived in the city and so forth. But I think it's very important that the conversation around parks can document in specific and tangible ways what benefits are. Because it's really important to change the conversation around these essential pillars of our public life. And we see what happens when there isn't enough organized support around issues like, say, congestion pricing. We are extremely vulnerable to weak government and the, you know, intangibles of changing elections. So one needs substantial, I think, armor. That armor comes from understanding in a real way, not just telling each other what we already believe. So that's my speech. I'll now shut up and turn this over. Let me begin with Eric, since Eric I want Eric for you to remind us where we came from. And I know you were going to talk about why parks are essential now too, but New York was not always this way. So, for instance, Eric, where are we and what would we have seen? Just give us a picture of what we would have seen out there.
Yeah, you know, so I've spent a lot of time thinking about the historical ecology of this place. And particularly when it comes to the way we imagine the city, we tend to think of the city as the permanent thing, and that we're, you know, putting the parks into the city. But the city is the temporary thing. The permanent thing is that river over there and that rock that's under the land over here. And what I think we need to conceive of is how we open up the nature of the place, right? So, you know, if we were here 400 years ago, say, the shoreline was 3 blocks that away, right? There was an island over there that was surrounded by massive salt marshes that would have protected the beach where all those tall buildings are. And there were Native Americans, people that have been living here for 8,000 years. And there was a place where they crossed just south of here to Stevens Point across the way, because that was the narrowest point across the river here. Sapelkainakan, just down here, kind of near where that Ganswort Beach Park is and Hudson River Park. And it's important, I think, to think about them because I don't think you had to tell the Lenape people or even indigenous people, you know, indigenous people that are living today or anywhere in the world that, you know, nature is vital to their lives, right? That's the obvious thing, right? That, you know, or that you would even imagine that you would have an infrastructure that would handle water or try and protect the air. I mean, these things are not free. They're not invisible. They are actually essential to, you know, to what it means to be a living person or a living organism of any kind here on this planet. And I think, you know, we have thought of ourselves in a very kind of arrogant way, almost like gods in the way that we've imagined ourselves living in this landscape. And that kind of arrogance has led us into making all kinds of mistakes, you know, including like changing the atmospheric composition in such a way that it holds so much more energy than now that our, you know, kind of way of living isn't possible anymore. Or to move the land around to actually add, you know, 3 blocks of land onto the side of an island. I mean, these are the acts of gods, and yet we've done them. I don't know. You know, I just think that for me, the reason parks are so important is they are the place where in New York City we connect back to the long history of this place and the long future. And any investments we make in these places is an investment in the future of this place and the city for as long as it can be here.
I mean, it's really interesting to think about what the city looked like and, you know, just how, as you say, man-made it has become. But I know, Eric, you're not against the idea of development. In other words, it's not. I think because we know each other, you're not framing this as man against nature. I think you love the city. So what is the? I mean, what is the balance that we're talking about. I think that's one of the
Yeah.
issues that is a problem, right? That people see it as an either or on both sides.
Yeah, well, I mean, as a moral proposition, all species deserve habitat. And what is habitat for people? You know, we have this ability to kind of create habitats, right? So we create the city as habitat for us. And you know, as Michael well knows, you know, my entire career is actually about making cities be successful, making them work over the long run because they're the best habitat for people. And because they're the best habitat for people, that means that we will get out of the way for the habitat of everything else, right? And in fact, you know, what is our particular like life history characteristic? We can actually, you know, conceive of the past and make a plan for the future and then talk to each other about it. This is something that's very difficult for most other species to manage. And so because of that, we actually have a capacity to make choices, priorities. And so, you know, as the commissioner was saying, it's really important to give, you know, information, but even more important is the wisdom that comes from that information. And this is actually the challenge we have here in the 21st century, is that we are losing the capacity to make wise choices about the future, right? And this is really the work of our generation, is to refashion a society that can make wise decisions that will, you know, allow us to persist, right? Not just for, you know, our generation, but for future generations.
So, Erica, you've been working around parks for a long time, and I know you have thoughts about the ways in which we need to think about organizing around public spaces and green spaces. So I just want to ask you, you know, what would you add to what Eric said?
Well, thank you for that question. I'm a social scientist with the Forest Service, and I've been based in New York City my entire career. And I've studied and had the luxury of studying and learning from communities throughout the city that support and engage with parks. And, you know, if you look on the wall behind us, there's all these different images, and parks aren't one thing, right? I'm often in awe of how many things parks are in terms of they're linear, they're square, they're rectangular, they're wetlands, they're wet, they're dry, you know, all these different types of parks. And there's all these different types of communities that derive meaning from those spaces. And over the years, I've studied not 10, not 20, not 100, but thousands of community-based efforts to show the love for these spaces. And, you know, we were speaking this morning, or the Sue and Lourdes were speaking about issues around equity and engagement. And, you know, capacity in our communities is uneven. You know, it isn't that people aren't aware of their parks or aren't aware of what's happening around them or don't love them anymore in one place or the other, but their capacity to do something about them is different. And that's different for a whole range of issues. And, you know, there's groups in this room right now that I've worked with over the years that struggle still. And, you know, we have this idea at the end of the day, you know, I'm going to fast forward a couple 100 years from you or more. And say, you know, we have this idea that, you know, parks are these static things, and that, you know, cities change, populations change, desires and needs, we change through the life course. So what we are taking from these spaces changes as we age, as we develop and grow. And so, you know, the idea about community engagement, community capacity, community stewardship organizations are essential to parks. Park workers are essential to parks. Philanthropy is essential to parks. Private sector is essential to parks, and government. And, you know, there's no way out of this configuration. You know, since the days of Olmsted, it was true, and it's true today. I think a lot of the things about, you know, that you study time in this epic way, right? And time is compressed for us. You know, budgets are compressed. Demands are compressed. Funders want things on a specific timeline. And I think we have to step back and see this as a living infrastructure. Who has a house plant? Anyone? Do you bring it in the house when you buy it and set it down and then forget it? No. Just imagine that on the scale of New York City parks. Who's lived with someone before? Just somebody. Okay? Do you ever talk to that person? Ask them how their day is? I mean, just think about, we're asking so much, in a odd way of our parks and the people who care for them. And so we have to see them as a living, breathing system, support them as such. Anyway, I could go on, but I won't.
Okay. I'm feeling guilty about my house plants now. Yeah. So, but let me switch gears for a second, because you talked about them being living, breathing parts of our lives, and I think that's part of the issue too, right? They're passive.
Yeah.
We often believe, even though they're activated in all sorts of ways. Gregg and Thelma have also been involved in lots of programs in parks and trying to think more deeply about how we activate parks. Thelma, maybe you could just talk a little about some of the programs you've done, and then we can dive in a little bit to how they have worked and how they've changed communities. But before you do that, you and I both grew up in the city. Did you grow up in the city too? Brooklyn? Okay. Queens, Manhattan.
Tri-state.
Oh, tri-state. I don't know.
I love it here, though.
Okay. All right.
Mm-hmm.
And what was your park?
My park growing up in Southeast Queens was Baisley Park, but which, lives with all kinds of history. I have to say, however, that, I am the child of two born and bred New Yorkers. My father was born in 1926 in Harlem, my mother in 1930 in Bed-Stuy. So they had I had even pictures that existed in our family of them in the parks. And so moving to Southeast Queens with a backyard meant that felt like a kind of aspiration that they had growing up. So, but it was a thrill for them, for me to first live in Brooklyn in Park Slope, shout out Prospect Park. But then, of course, to move to Harlem and to live among our historic Harlem parks. And to think about them as part of our cultural infrastructure in Harlem. So as Dr. Rodriguez and Commissioner Donoghue said, in speaking about not just equity, but investment in community. At the Studio Museum in Harlem, it has always been our goal to create access to the arts, right? To exist as an art institution that thinks of itself not only through how it engages the art, but how it engages our community, right? Our community that's in our name, the Studio Museum in Harlem. And so in many ways, often when people think about cultural institution outreach, it has this sort of, geographic distance to it, right? Institutions are going to community. For us, we always think about how we can create more art experience right in the neighborhood where we are. So as we began to think about the building project we're now in, which would mean we'd be closed for some time, not as long as we thought, but that's another story. It was very natural to imagine partnering with our parks and to create a public art program that began in 2016, bringing contemporary artists making commission works in our historic Harlem parks. Now, this project was incredibly inspired by the amazing work that had been done with public art all through the parks all over the city. We did not invent this. There's nothing about it that was new. What was significant was it was our way to think about how we could be as a cultural institution. Now, if we could have brought our collection and put it in the parks, we would have, right? That was sort of what the spirit was. While we didn't have a building, how could we create an institution in these spaces that meant so much to people? But couldn't bring the collection, so commission artists. And the important idea was to create experiences for people in the parks that existed within the experiences they were already having, right? Not to create a separate, like this is art with a big A, but are you in the park every day? Are you encountering this work? Can it become part of the way you see the park? Can it become part of the experiences that people have there? So for us at the Studio Museum, it was a way to be in partnership with our parks, but it also, for parks, the historic Harlem parks, which have had a history, and we support and felt so committed to allowing, as Dr. Rodriguez says, people to understand how these parks existed now, right? Not in the memory that some had of them, but what was there, the amenities to really support what had been done in all the work to make those parks safe, cared for, and filled with amenities. So it was also to allow our funders to see the parks, the Harlem parks in that way, to see them as a critical part of the cultural infrastructure of Harlem and hopefully create more opportunities like the one that we are having now that we are in the parks, but also for other culturals as well and other kinds of institutions that exist uptown.
Yeah, I like your phrase cultural infrastructure. You know, I was reminded, I'm sure some of you here know Eric Kleinenberg's book studying the Chicago heat wave, which occurs to us on days like this, and how much that social infrastructure, which was partly a cultural infrastructure, and parks were crucial to it. It wasn't just that they were places of relief, they were places where people came together, and that bonding was crucial to the ability of people to endure stress and crisis.
Completely. And in a community like Harlem, we've always understood the ways in which the museum could be a place where people could find a moment of inspiration, of engagement, of education, of entertainment, you know, that could be, and a way to encounter each other. But we also know that, you know, on days with heat like this, that museums and parks are the two places people want to go. Museums to get cool and, you know, parks to enjoy, right? What it means to be out on these beautiful days. So it was also about, quite honestly, realizing how significantly many people did not feel a barrier to entry to parks, right? But museums often can feel intimidating. So what if we took that away by creating these art experiences that could happen in places people were already going, with the hope that these experiences also open up the possibility that they then could and would think about museums as a place open to them as well.
It's interesting. Is there one particular, I don't want to put you on the spot, but is there one particular project that where like the penny dropped for you about how this works or that it's working?
Well, all of the projects have been amazing, from our first that happened in all 4 parks in 2016 to the last one that was up that ended in 2022 with Thomas J. Price. But the significant moment, of course, was the project with Chloe Bass in St. Nicholas Park, which involved a series of sort of beautifully created by Chloe, an amazing conceptual artist, signs that asked important questions about how one thought of themselves and the world. And all of our projects were meant to be up for a year, but that project, of course, was meant to end in September of 2020, but it ended up staying up longer for all the reasons we know. And it was amazing to me to hear from my Harlem neighbors about how much that project and the repetition of walking through that park and the project was called Wayfinding, because quite literally it's what it did, and how those questions about care and hope and love resonated so deeply in that moment. And so that project felt like it really crystallized for me why, you know, this project began, because we didn't have a building, we didn't have a gallery space, but how important it will be for us to hopefully continue working in the parks, even when the museum reopens.
Yeah, and of course that moment was really important for reminding us that the place people felt that they were safe and could come together and breathe was outdoors, was the park. So there was a real correlation, wasn't there, between that idea of feeling safe and feeling at home when you were out. So Greg, what was your park growing up?
So from Brooklyn, of course, Prospect Park. But actually there was several parks. So first of all, I love the Parks Department, and I'm not saying that because, you know,
You're
a lot
just
of good
sucking
friends
up
here.
now, I can see.
But growing up, I grew up in East Flatbush on New York Avenue, and way back, I think in the 80s, there used to be these signs called Clarendon Meadows, and it depicted a lot of trees. And I remember looking at my block, and it was so stark. There was only like a couple trees, and then Michael Bloomberg came and the Million Trees Project. And I remember, I think I was a teenager or whatever, and I immediately called the Parks Department. I was like, I want trees. And now, you know, 20 years later, I'm walking on New York Avenue, and it's just tree lined. It's beautiful, and you know, you feel good about doing something for your community. But I also remember playing football in J Park. I don't know if it's even called J Park, but it's somewhere down off of Avenue J in a junction, and that was our space, our safe space to play football. And of course, J Park went through a renovation. They ripped up the fields and put benches and all that kind of stuff. And as kids, we were like, what the hell is this? So then we got displaced over to Albany and I think it was Foster or somewhere over there by Pathmark. But I grew up in the parks. And I think part of my lived experience, and I love the discussion this morning about equity, because there's so many parallel thoughts that I want to convey of how important that is. That having access, it's not just about, yes, it's about the space, it's about being able to go out. And as we know, in 2020, like literally the parks was our life source of like safety. But it's also about access, you know, and I love the swimming initiative. You know, I grew up in an area where there wasn't a lot of pools, right? And it is statistically, you know, especially Black kids do not know how to swim. And so when you think about that, what does that mean? So let me now tie two things together. So in 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, Joe and Clara Tsai bought the New York Liberty. Yes, the Liberty's owned not by the Dolans, but by us now. I have to keep reminding folks that. And the Brooklyn Nets. And after the murder of George Floyd, they made a commitment to invest $50 million into Brooklyn over the next 10 years. So that's up until 2030 to address racial justice and economic mobility. And so you're probably thinking, what does swimming have to do with economic mobility? Well, when you look at the maritime industry, we are surrounded. The only borough that's not surrounded by water is the Bronx. That's right. all of us are surrounded by, the rest of the boroughs are surrounded by water. But I guarantee you talk to a kid in East New York, in Brownsville, in East Flatbush, we do not even think about a career in maritime. And we don't think about a career in maritime because we can't swim, right? And most of these jobs, there are 300,000 maritime jobs in New York City, only 10% are actually occupied by New Yorkers. These jobs are paying $150,000, $200,000. That's economic mobility. And literally, if individuals had accessible pools, that would be a whole economy that's unlocked. So we are not building pools, the Joe and Clara Tsai Foundation, the Social Justice Fund, but what we are doing is we are looking at making investments in communities that are underserved. And I love that that conversation earlier, because when you make an investment in a community, the community actually feels good about it. And it changes a lot of the perception. Sometimes when communities are underinvested, the perception is that government doesn't care. When people think government doesn't care, then it's a whole cascading things of activities that happen. And so everything from like removing graffiti is important in communities, but it's also important that we have every community has world-class parks. Government can't do it alone. As someone who's worked in government for 13 years, I know government tries to do it, but they can't do it alone. That's where philanthropy comes in. And it's great for us. Well, number one, it's great that I have a pre-existing relationship with Marty and the whole parks team in terms of understanding how to navigate government to actually make that impact. Because that's the important thing for philanthropy. You know, we want to actually see that impact immediately. And what we don't want to happen is what happened in like Newark, where you make a whole bunch of investment in the education system, for example, and you have nothing to show. Government can be very bureaucratic. And so having the apparatus, and that's why it's so great to work with parks, having the apparatus where we can make an investment and see the results of that investment in like literally 6 weeks is so important. But what we are doing, yes, we're a basketball team. Of course, this is sort of like fan development, et cetera. But we are actually taking a different spin to this. We are looking at neighborhoods that have high rate of gun violence. And that study that you talked about is actually one of the studies that Clara and I talked about in terms of how to have alternatives to the criminal justice system. We don't need to be pouring money into the NYPD. And yes, I could say that because I'm not in government anymore. We need to be pouring money into the Parks Department to actually have more resources, right? We need to be pouring money into SBS. Like I always tell people, like my former agency, we're responsible for helping people find jobs and helping people start businesses. Our budget is $100 million, $100 million. NYPD is like some odd billion, right? Just a percentage of that, right? And so for us, it's really focused on, and we try to be the catalyst, right? And I think that's philanthropy is always we want to start something and we want to make sure that that continues. And so if we make an investment in a community, we want then government to say, okay, we're going to continue that investment. And so we're really pleased. Last year we did about 8 courts. We selected neighborhoods. Sunset Park is a little bit different because it's in our backyards. We wanted to be good corporate citizens, but we focus on flatlands. We upgraded parks in East New York. This year, we're looking at Bed-Stuy, and we're going to continue looking at these neighborhoods because one of the things that I've heard anecdotally, and it's happened, is that the park that we upgraded in Flatlands, the community loves it. The community appreciates it. It's sort of like it's a pride for the community now because that what they're seeing now is that somebody paid attention and there's now those investments. And for sure, it's not just building and refurbishing basketball courts, but it's really getting, and in that community, the local council member added additional funding for a local organization to do Saturday Night Lights. So now we have programming that will help young people stay off the streets. And that's the goal for us. And that's why parks are so important across the city. And the last thing I'll say, and then I'll stop, is as someone who worked in economic development, there's a reason why when you look at the sort of like, what is the formula for a thriving city, right? Safety, of course, the workforce, but guess what's in there? Parks. Because when a company is attracting people here, they're like, okay, you can go to the High Line, right? Or you can go to Prospect Park, or you could go to Central Park, or you could go to J Park. Like literally, that's what people want to hear is like, where am I going to build my family, my community? And it's definitely not, the cold streets of New York City. It's our parks.
So could you talk a little more about what's the correlation between parks and, let's say, gun violence rates and how this actually works on the ground?
So I think the immediate correlation is, and there's so many different things. Like, so growing up in East Flatbush, I could talk specifically about my lived experience. There's a lot of latchkey kids, and literally you have families who are working full time, and there's no adult supervision, and that's what it boils down to. It's like peer pressure, no adult supervision, and these are kids, right? Brains are not formed yet. And so there's a lot of peer pressure in terms of doing things that they're not supposed to do. They hang out with individuals that they think is sort of like looking out for them. And then they get themselves, sort of caught up in things that normally, if they were programming where they are able to have mentors, that they would actually have somebody to help them like process what they're about to do. And so the correlation is really like just getting kids busy. Right. My grandmother used to say, idle hand is the devil's. like literally, grandparents you got to love them. Right. They're so smart. And so you got to keep the kids busy and literally having, if you have a park that's in disrepair, then there's no usage. And so there has to be alternative forms of programming, and sometimes they're not accessible, et cetera. But if there's a park that's in pristine condition, there's so many different ways you could program that park and keep kids busy. And when kids are busy, they are more likely not to get involved in sort of like the neighborhood activities, et cetera, because they're not connected to that. And so that's why we want to make sure that we also partner. When we do these partnerships, that there's a local organization that could utilize the court. And so we also look for, we invest in also organizations, Center for Justice Innovation, for example, where they will provide some type of programming, because it's not just enough to refurbish the park, but you've got to have something to actually a program to utilize the park.
I was thinking as you were talking, this was sort of skirting around this. If you sort of look back on history, not Eric's history, which is 450 million years old, but I just mean last 100 years or so. So much of the process of transformation in not just here, but in cities across America has been towards a kind of privatization of public spaces. And Dr. Rodriguez was mentioning, the POPs, the privately owned public spaces. I mean, we live in a capitalist system, which requires I'm sure Sue would like 5% of the budget and deserves it. But we're somehow expecting that there is always going to be some private investment. You're talking about the balance of philanthropic money and corporate money and so forth. You know, we created suburbs that provide people with backyards who could afford them, and then did redlining, and then sort of neglected the parks. And then we wonder why there's, you know, incredible inequity and health discrepancies and so forth. So that's my little speech, but it's interesting. We've come back to a point where I think we now understand better that that there are literal costs as well as human costs to not having these investments in things like parks. And I come back to libraries, the same sort of issue around providing, especially latchkey kids, with places. What is the argument? Maybe I could ask Eric too. What is the argument to philanthropies to understand, for instance, their role, but also to corporate sponsors to understand their role? We clearly don't want to create these places which are only sort of public in name, but we do want the participation we need in this society, the participation of people to understand why this is good business too. What is that argument? Yeah, go ahead.
I'll take a stab at
Take a
that. I think part of the argument is, and it's kind of clunky and maybe a little technocratic, apologies, but it's to understand, again, parks, park workers, community-based organizations, as a system, right? As an ecosystem in and of itself. And so if you want to help that system, you know, it doesn't make sense to say, I'm just going to help this part of it, the part I like or I'm interested in, and it must conform to what this. I mean, you have to kind of lean into that system and support it as a whole. I mean, I hope that's not too weird and abstract, you know, but I think a lot of times, you know, I hear from community-based organizations that I work with and municipalities that I work with that they're constrained by the grants that they are given. They're grateful for them. They need them. They're desperate for them, but they're often constrained by them because of this little twist, you know, of wanting these, you know, precise outcomes. And it's messy, you know. Park work, park care, community engagement has to be on its own timeline. You know, nature is on its own timeline. Communities are on its own timeline. And so to be able to understand that as a system and support it as a system, I think somebody said, you know, if we get resources for one part of the city or one particular park, what are the ways that, you know, the whole can share in that? You know, this kind of thinking has to be baked in, I think, to philanthropy, and understanding parks and the city and the people that benefit from it as a system. That's not to say there's not certain parts of the system that need more care than others, but just to kind of go back and forth between those things.
Makes sense, Eric.
Well, I think this is where I would hit the resilience point.
Yeah.
That, you know, the atmosphere is so changed that we're going to be seeing more and more of these intense storms as we've been seeing before. And the only way the city survives, I mean, these things are an existential risk to the city. And so we need to have systems that can adapt to the new conditions. And nature is the only thing that knows how to do that. You know, the stormwater system that the DEP manages was, you know, constructed 100 years ago for a different climate and not anticipating the climate now. And it's, you know, it's way more than the kind of monies that Sue is talking about to even start to imagine what a, you know, revised system of pipes would do that a stream could do or the wetland could do. There's many of these natural areas that are existing in the parks system now that are really, really important to the future of the city. I don't think Sue's portfolio or Sue's, you know, the people that come after Sue is going to be 30,000 acres. I think it's going to be 40 or 50,000 acres of the city by the end of the century, because that is the only way that the rest of the city will survive, is to be doing these things. So we have to maintain what we have now, but we have to be anticipating what the future is going to bring. And that's important for everybody that you mentioned, Michael. You know, for everybody who's committed to New York City persisting into the future, they got to be you know, New York City will only persist if we can adapt to the climate, and nature is the way we're going to adapt for the future.
And I think I would simply add that also to your question, you know, how to make this argument to philanthropy. I think when we frame the argument around people, around New Yorkers, and not around institutions, right? Where then we begin to talk about parks differently than we might talk about museums, differently than we might talk about social service. But if we think holistically around how we want to impact our neighbors, our audiences, our, sort of fellow citizens of this city, then we make an argument that then supports the idea of investments in the places that are going to create the most opportunity for people to live in ways that we all believe they should in this city when we believe in equity and justice and democracy.
Yeah. Two little thoughts out of that. One is, I would say, and also a functioning economy, because there is also an interest, especially from corporate types, in what is you were saying, Greg, earlier, that it's true. Companies are attracted by the idea that you have green spaces, and literally. But there's really something interesting that's you're all suggesting, which is that we need to talk more in terms of systems, and that's a really difficult conversation. I mean, we've become a really impatient society, and systems are complicated, and they're not short stories. You're going to say something.
Well, I'm just going to jump on this economy. So when we talk about business and parks being viable to the tourist economy in New York City, or the large business corporate economy, if we look at it as a system, it's also very important to the dog walker, to the nanny, to the person who gathers a few people and does like a little exercise routine, park, I should join one of these days, but these kind of things in the parks, I've interviewed a lot of these folks over the years, made observations, and there's a lot of people, or just everyday people, for the parks are an essential part of their personal household economy, and that's important to remember. And look at from a systems point of view, like that's just keep pivoting from the local to the global.
Yeah, I guess what I meant, I agree, but what I meant, I wrote about homelessness in Houston a year or so ago, a couple of years ago, and one of the really complicated things about talking about how Houston had reduced its homeless count so drastically 70% was that it required talking about a system, and all of our stories we tell each other are either about some human calamity, which is an easy story to tell as a journalist. That's why every time you open my newspaper, you just want to commit harakiri, because those stories are easy and there are a lot of them. Or we want to tell a story of some individual success, which, because it personalized things, and I get that, and that's important. But you can't understand big problems necessarily without talking about systems, and we have not enough patience to understand that all of these things are linked. We've talked here about history and climate and gun violence and culture, and around parks. And so I think it's really a difficult conversation to have. But it's a necessary one, because otherwise we treat these things as separate. And ultimately that's not working at the scale we need in a city like New York to tackle the problems we face around equity and climate and, everything else, frankly. So that's my little speech again. But I do think this is a problem, right? We want to atomize things in order to make them more comprehensible, and sometimes things don't really work that way.
So I was going to jump in on philanthropy, because in terms of convincing philanthropy, one of the challenges, and you're right, it is difficult, because we're always looking, everything that we do at the Social Justice Fund, we measure and evaluate, right? Because at the end of 10 years, Clara is going to want to know, like, okay, $50 million, what did we accomplish? Anyone who's giving out their money will want to know, like, what did we accomplish? So I think it's important for parks to, like, and especially in speaking to philanthropy, understand the language. Yes, certainly we have realized, and when we do our grants, it's all general operating, right? Because we don't want to be restrictive. I think there's a whole sort of narrative in the philanthropic community about sort of like general operating grants, et cetera. But I think for us, and to weave that story together, it's important to, yes, like we've made this investment and this is what happened after, to give us that information, give us that data, or even talk about sort of like, if you're talking to corporations, why that's important in terms of your recruitment, right? Like to have a park. So you can kind of tie those narratives together, because sometimes it's not obvious. It's clear to me because I worked in economic development, but for somebody else, they may not actually see that.
So along those lines, I mean, and I have to say, I understand this myself from a little way from a headway, and I understand that people want to see specific results. And we can probably cite them. I wrote about some parks in Hoboken recently, where Hoboken had invested after Sandy and then, created these various resilience strategies, and they seem to actually work. And that was interesting to write about because there's a hunger. I'll say this as a writer, there's a hunger for those stories. People that particular story, which was small, got an unusually big reaction, because I think people want to hear what solutions look like. You don't have to promise them the world, but just tell them something that actually works. And I think especially nowadays, that's really an issue for people. There's a feeling that we've lost a sense of control. So I think I personally think these stories are really important to form for all sorts of reasons, and be able to share. From the perspective, Thelma, of the museum moving forward, you're going to open. You have this amazing building. It's going to open shortly, I hope. So what?
Michael's trying to get me to tell him when it's going to open, but I'm not taking the bait here since we're on the record. Okay? Clearly.
So I tried, at least. It's fine. But we all look forward to going. But what's going to be the ongoing relationship you have? Because this was a sort of a project that you started if the idea the museum would be closed.
Exactly. And it's a project that we'd always wished for, because we had been thrilled to see all of the other cultural institutions who either in ongoing ways or one-off ways had existed in our Harlem parks, even some who had done so unofficially. Right. And, we have to talk about that, the way people in communities feel ownership of their parks. And even though there are processes and systems, quite often there's a way in which, what can happen in the parks really comes out of the community. And often when people, talk to us about bringing art to the park, I was very careful to make sure that everyone understands that there's a lot of culture in our parks. Right? The evidence of what people care about, what they listen to, what they have made lives deeply in our parks always. And as a cultural institution, we were looking to honor that. And so we look forward to continuing, right, to be in the parks. But we also look forward to the idea that our projects live in community with many other organizations that are working in the parks. And we just hope that this moment can create more opportunity for more organizations across the art sector to be in our historic Harlem parks. Our band shell at Jackie Robinson has been redone. And so what I know that means for our performing arts peers, of course, we have the great band shell in Marcus Garvey Park, but St. Nicholas and Morningside also continue to host all kinds of culture. And again, for many people, their first experiences of some of our cultural institutions come through the programs and projects that happen in the park. So we really hope to continue. I mean, we see the parks as our neighbors. And I want to also give gratitude here to the many volunteer organizations, because they are the ones who really, stepped up first to thank us for, what it meant to kind of be in partnership and to be able to kind of exist in the space they created. And, as someone who, has been privileged to work in a cultural institutions in my entire career, but at the Studio Museum for 24 years, without partnership, without these connections to community, as a cultural institution, your work really does not resonate. And so really, really thrilled to think about what a future can be, and to think about that in relation to our peers and our colleagues in the parks and in the community.
Yeah, I mean, the idea is it's a two-way thing, right? So you go out there and then also you build back relationships at the institution. People will
Exactly.
feel
And-
at home in your institution too.
Right.
Not-
And that we all exist, again, in service.
Yeah.
And so that we continue to allow our understanding of service to the community to be one that is bound around the ideas, really the ideals of our Harlem community.
So we have, we're running a little late behind the schedule, but we have a few minutes for questions. So we're happy to take them. My memory, Eric, is when we talked about this, that this was a white beach along.
So on the other side, you can still see.
There's
the-
still a white beach. I
Yes.
don't mean the Gansevoort thing they built. I mean the
Yeah.
actual white beach. Cool.
I can ask a question. Hi.
Hi.
You opened the panel talking about time and going back in time. So this is a question for everyone. What is your vision and hope for the future of the park system and the social infrastructure that cares for it, say 50 years or 100 years from now? And who's missing from the conversation today that would help us achieve that vision?
For everyone. Go ahead. No. Well, why me? Okay. That was a three-parter. Two-parter.
Vision.
So vision, oh gosh. Well, I think a bit about what Eric was saying is that we can draw upon the history, the underlying history, both social and ecological, that's here, and start to bring that back as we try and address some of the complex issues of our time, which climate change, persistent poverty, isolation. You know, how can we harness the past, the present, to make a better future is something that is abiding and I think really important to continue to ask ourselves, to not forget the footprint of those or the work of others. I mean, every community organization that might be present in this room could say they were founded probably because they were inspired by something else someone did in the community and built on that and moved forward. So how that we can take our own social legacies and build forward and do that in conjunction with the natural processes.
Well, I mean, my vision is that the streams look back and the wetlands. You know, this place was just chock full of streams in the past that helped move the water. And I think those are all opportunities for making the parks. And I think, you know, I guess my hope is that someday that the Parks Department, you know, gets the kind of funding that the police department gets now, and the police department won't need it because the whole city will be so safe. And that, you know, that this will be the great triumph that will lead New York City into the 22nd century. That this is why the city will be succeeding, is because it has this park system in the same way that Central Park set up the 20th century, you know, for the city's, you know, successes. And in some ways, you know, the High Line, you know, Little Island, even like, you know, that Google building, St. John's Terminal, like these are all really important investments in how we're renaturing the city. I mean, when people are writing the history books from 100 years from now, what are they going to be saying about our time? Are they going to talk about these pencil towers? I think they're going to be talking about nature and equity, right? And the cities that do best on that will be the cities that will be here 100 years from now.
Yeah, and my hope, including these two amazing contributions already, is that when we think about already, I mean, the case has already been made when we look at what the Parks Department has done. My hope is that it continues, but it continues with this beautiful equity lens, so that when we're talking about this, we're talking about it in a true five-borough way and touching some of those communities that don't have, say, tourists, or you can't make the other cases that often are there, but that those New Yorkers equally can benefit from what it means to sort of think about a resilient strategy, to think about strategies around climate, and think about these strategies around well-being, right? And what it means to think broadly into a future that really represents true equity in that regard.
I think everyone has covered what I would say in terms of vision, but I think who's missing from the conversation, I would probably say the 1%, because that is where the wealth is, and certainly, you know, government. We'd like to see funding on par, as we talked about, but there has to be additional funding that comes into the parks ecosystem, and only those with true wealth have to be, they have to be part of the conversation to understand like why that's important to them, as well as, to make sure that parks is equitably, sort of like built all across the city.
I'm just saying one tiny thing, which is that I think it's also useful to remember. I mean, Eric's talked about this in terms of eons, but the city changes all the time, and parks change all the time, and Central Park has changed a lot over time. We have the capacity, and we have always had the capacity, to modify our parks, to find new land, and to build out places that have been allowed to decline. So, I mean, this is important. There's nothing. We talk about a city built of concrete and stone and brick, but actually it's as much an evolving organism, and that's something we need to remind people about.
Hi, I do have a Betsy Smith, and I would like to go back to something that Michael started with and that Gregg referenced to, which is the data we need. I don't think, in my view, and I'm in the world of philanthropy, and I talk to a lot of people about supporting parks. That's basically the core of what the Central Park Conservancy does, is to get community support for the park and other parks. I think what's missing is the data on no one in this room or anywhere actually has any question about the merit of parks and their power and to change communities and to really make cities thrive, and how crucial parks are to cities. What's missing, in my view, is quantifying the benefits of parks, because without that, we are not going to get the government support we need. So I would disagree a little bit with regard to philanthropy support of parks, because I think it's there. I think what we really need to do is have the data persuade the government to really invest in the infrastructure, because infrastructure really isn't the world of philanthropy. Infrastructure is the world of government, and government should really step up to that, and in terms of ongoing care of their investment. So I think, Michael, you mentioned data in the beginning, and I think it's a really, really important point that we somehow find a way to quantify the benefits of parks so that we make the argument to government so that they will really support a capital and operating plan that can support our parks.
Yeah, just one thought about that though too, which is that the part of the problem with data is that it often can only be accumulated in the short term. So Eric was mentioning, for instance, storm capture issues, and the existing system that we have, which is more than a century old. To change that is going to take generations, and what kind of political will and economic will is there to sort of understand those results? One of the reasons Hoboken was interesting to people is it's small, and so it could make these changes over a finite period of time that could be sort of easily documented once a storm happens. New York's a big place, and these problems are complicated. So we also have to get people to understand that things take time, and therefore continued investment.
Oh, well, I'll just say something, and I agree, quantifying, qualifying the importance of these spaces for government funding and other types of funding sources is important. And it's doable, and it's been done. And we could do more of it, and it would be a number that would be so staggeringly high that it would almost be laughable, but it would be a real number. So I think sometimes, thinking about providing that evidence is one way to go about it. The other is understanding that, we are in this kind of world where we're constantly, and I'm with the Forest Service, putting out fires, right? So the parks aren't on fire. They're pretty good. They're good. And so, we're constantly in this mode of going into the crisis, right? And attending to that first. And it goes back to this conversation about really, truly understanding things as a living system, about maintenance and care, and that's abiding, and that's never going to go away. And that we have to make that part of the DNA of the work that we do, caring for each other, caring for the places where we live, caring for relationships and partnerships, having different ways of knowing through art and other, collaborations, so that we can evolve as a people and come up with good innovations. To me, I hear you. That is a hard elevator pitch. I'm already out of the elevator with that one. To convince someone, but it's the hearts, the minds, it's the data. We need it all.
We have time for one more question.
Can you hear me? My understanding from, I can't remember who, but is that cities with an investment of about 2% in parks tend to have good, well cared for park systems. So as we're all advocating for 1%, it's half of what would be needed to have well cared for. And if we're talking about equity and long-term sustainability, it seems like that is another consideration. And I guess the question is, if it's not even on the table of conversation, that we should be not asking for 1%, but asking for 2% in order to make our parks equitable. And if we're investing billions of dollars in infrastructure, living and other, to update our parks, if there's no maintenance plan, if there's no support for the bathrooms being kept open past 6 o'clock at night when the park usage goes on until 10 o'clock at night, how do you all suggest that we go from the idea to the vision without the investment? And private investment is wonderful, but I think what we've seen in the last decade plus since that started, since that really got invested in, is that private investment goes to the wealthiest communities, the communities with the most clout to create change. And in many ways, it seems that what that has done is allowed the rest of the communities to suffer from a lack of investment, not because of any one thing, but because you have a lack of people with clout fighting for parks. So if we continue with the public-private partnerships, and I run a nonprofit that helps bring, support to community parks that aren't as well serviced. And with that, how do we get to these visions that you all are talking about and best utilize this infrastructure plan that is coming in?
I'll just jump in really quickly and say, this is the same sort of conversation I have with how to help our education system, right? It starts with the local community. And I will always say elections matter. Civic engagement is important because the community needs to, the clout that you're talking about is really the community agitating their local council member, who's then agitating the commissioner about this particular issue in a particular neighborhood. And there are certain communities that they have a healthy ecosystem and system where, if something breaks in a park, it's fixed really quickly, right? Or if there's something wrong with the education system. So I think our communities need to sort of understand the agency that they have. We need to hold the local council members accountable. Certainly it starts at the top, right? We need let me be careful how I say this, but we need at the top, an administration that understands that investment in parks is just as equally important as investment in law enforcement. We also need to have a legislature that understands we need to put more money into these resources. And so I think, and I'll stop at this point, is that every single elected council member needs to have sort of an understanding on how all these things connect to their local community. And then certainly on the administration side, just a support to continue investing in local parks.
I think, so thanks. Okay, I think we've run out of time. But I really wanted to thank the panel. Everyone was really great. Thank you. And I'll turn it back to Sue.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you, Gregg. Thank you, Eric, Thelma, Erica. Such an inspiring conversation and panel, and really is music to so many of our ears talking about the importance, the vital importance of our parks. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it. These conversations have really been so enlightening and energizing, and we've discussed a wide range of critical issues affecting our city, how to build a resilient city, how to address issues of climate change, how can we help to promote public health, combat historic and ongoing inequality in the system, what can we do to foster community in alienating times. And just like we saw during the pandemic, we know our public green spaces are critical to this dialogue, places of refuge and connection. And since the pandemic, parks have not lost that importance. They are more vital than ever. And so it's clear to us at the Parks Department that parks, we know, so all of us know in this room, as we just discussed, they're not luxuries. They're critical public resources that can help solve, that can help address so many of the issues that we've talked about today. This recognition that parks are essential, that they're vital to a livable, equitable city is at the core of our Vital Parks Plan. This is a new framework for thinking about and driving change in our public green spaces. It's an acknowledgement that a vital park system is one that's clean and safe, green and resilient, and supported by a community of engaged and empowered New Yorkers. So with this plan, we're looking to strengthen our citywide network of that living infrastructure that we've talked about this morning, making our city not only more beautiful, but also targeting our investments where we know they're needed most. And that's why, by creating clean and safe public spaces, inviting New Yorkers into green and resilient spaces, and by engaging New Yorkers in the care of our shared spaces, we know that we can build a healthier, more livable city for all of New Yorkers. And so with this initial investment of $3.2 billion, we're already making progress towards that goal. We are working towards creating a comprehensive citywide network to expand access, to make it so that it's easier to get involved, get engaged with parks. And the true impact of our Vital Parks Plan, we hope will go even further to ensure that everybody can benefit from all that our living infrastructure has to offer. We're putting the power in the hands of everyday New Yorkers. That's why I referenced today we're launching these powerful online tools to put that information in the hands of the communities that need it, to make New Yorkers understand what goes into a vital park system and how we're working neighborhood by neighborhood to accomplish that. So these tools are available outside. We've got some folks who can demo the system. We want to make sure that you have an opportunity to take a look at them. And then also importantly to us with these online tools, we also want to hear from New Yorkers. There is an opportunity to give comments. We know we've got work to do. We know that what we're going to do with this tool, with mapping all of our assets, which we've done, we know that there's gaps. We know there's more to do. We want to hear from New Yorkers about where those gaps exist. Tell us what is needed. Help us direct those important investments to where they're needed most. So I want to just thank everyone again so much for spending the morning with us. I personally, I know I'm biased. I can't think of a better thing to be spending the morning on than Vital Parks and all of what is so important to them. But as you explore these new tools, as you look at our report on the way out, I encourage you to check out your own neighborhood, talk to your neighbors, imagine what more we can do as a city. And by providing this information to help parks make decisions, we're empowering all of our community members with the information they need to come together with other like-minded New Yorkers outside of this room to continue to advocate for the change, the kind of investment we've talked about this morning that is so important. I want to just take a minute to give a huge shout out to the people who helped make this forum possible: Jen Hoppe, J.C. Peoples, Claudia Saraceda, and importantly, all of the thousands of parkies who are out there every day, toiling in the heat, taking care of our green spaces, doing incredible work all across the park system. So also think about thanking a parkie when you see them. They're so vital to the work that we do. Overall, again, thank you so much for coming. Thank you to our incredible panelists who are here. I look forward to seeing you all in the parks. Thank you so much.